One. Hello, everyone. It's Jennifer. I'm waving at you like you can see me, but you can't. I'm back. I have a new video. I'm going to try to make this as short as possible. Should be no longer than 20 minutes because we're just going over background information. If I'm talking too fast, I apologize, but I really feel like I need to get through this video so I can move on to some more meatier videos like linear games and grouping games and sequencing games and so forth. Let's get to it. On the outset, there are a total of six different types of games. Three of the games are rare. You will hardly ever see them. I think making a video is a waste of my time. And to be quite honest, all you need to do is get the Power Score Bible, go over the rare games, do a couple of the examples, and call it a day. Just in case that the game actually pops up on the exam, but it's highly unlikely. So the games that I'm going to go over are the games that occur in every single LSAT. And the first of which will be the linear games. And the second will be the grouping games. And the third will be the pure sequencing games. Now, games. What are they? Well, they're just games where the positioning of the variables are fixed in some way. And here's an example of a scenario from a old prep test. I can't remember which one. I should have notated it. I'll notate it in the comments. Here we have six factories inspected Monday through Saturday. Exactly one factory per day is inspected. Each factory is inspected only once. This is your very basic grouping game. Um, Grouping games can get really difficult, but essentially at its core, you're just trying to figure out where the variables can be placed. And here's an example of the kind of rules that you'll find in linear games. The rules will state things like F cannot be last, or H is either first or second. You'll see things like, M has to be inspected immediately before N, or you'll see like G has to be inspected only on Wednesdays. It's very, very specific rules that you'll receive in linear games. And rules as well. Grouping games are just games where variables are grouped together based on the rules of the logic game. I always try to think of grouping games like I always try to think of grouping games as if I am trying to arrange the seating for a wedding. You have the two cousins that hate each other, so they can't sit at the same tables. You have, the wedding party that all has to sit at, one table. It's just, that's basically what grouping games are at their basic. These tend to be the hardest games I find because there's various different types of grouping games, and we'll go into that. But here's an example of one of the easiest grouping games. You have nine people, five of which are children, four are adults. They're going on a canoe trip. There are three canoes. We have to divide these nine people. Well, we have to take these people and split them up into three groups. And the rules are always going to state stuff like F must be in the same group as J, or it'll say if F is in, canoe 1, then J is in canoe 3, or it'll say F and J cannot belong in the same canoe together. In this case, because we're differentiating between children and adults, it might be a rule like there has to be at least one adult in each canoe. And I actually think that is a rule, if I'm not mistaken. And last up, pure sequencing games. These are actually my favorite. And, basically, these are games where a set of variables are ranked in some kind of order. Who's the tallest? Who was born when? Who's the oldest? Who's the shortest? Who's the fattest? Doesn't matter. You have to figure out what kind of order that they may be in. And here's an example of what a sequencing game could look like. 8 partners. We have to figure out which partner was hired in 1961 all the way down through 1968. And the questions are going to be, I'm sorry, not the questions, but the rules are going to say things like Hodges joined before Nader. You'll see a lot of the rules will be structured like this. You might get some rules that'll state that a variable can't be last, or you'll get a statement that'll say Hodges joined before Nader but after Michaels. And just a quick note that sequencing games and logic games seem similar, very similar. They are very similar, but at the same time, they're very different. One of the ways that they're different are the rules. Sequencing game rules are going to be very generic, like the example that I have here. Linear game rules are going to be more specific. It's going to say things like F is, F is third, or F is inspected on Fridays, or J and F cannot be inspected back to back. Just it's going to be very specific rules. Sequencing games will not. The rules are going to be just just like I have here. 4, 3, 4, 5 rules that are just kind of generic and bland like this. Um, so moving on. Before the fun begins, let's talk the basics of the logic game. Let's start with the section, the logic games section itself. In each LSAT, there's one logic game section, and it has 4 different logic games. And the section itself will have 22 to 24. Recent LSATs have had 23 questions, so that's about 5 to 7 questions per game. Now, each logic game consists of 3 parts. You have the scenario, you have the rules, and you have the questions. The scenario basically tells you about the variables and gives you some parameters. It'll tell you things like how many variables there are, what those variables are. Are they people? Are they dogs? Cats, toys, books, doesn't matter, music. It will tell you what the variable is, and then it'll give you some parameters. I wouldn't say rules. Sometimes there are like little specific rules, but basically, the parameters will be things like there are 3 groups, there are 4 groups, there are, 8 variables, and we have to fit them in order in 8 days. So here's an example from Prep Test 3, Game 2, of this is a linear games. This is a linear, this is a basic linear game. 7 houses, 7 families. Each house is occupied by exactly one of the 7 families. Tells you all the houses are on the same side of the street, which runs from west to east. In the scenario, this is the most important part about the scenario. It will tell you what type of game that you're working on. So if you just read the scenario, you will know the game that you're working on and what strategy you need to use to get through the game. Are the rules. And the rules apply to every question for that specific game. And they give you even parameters that are even more in depth. They tell you where variables can and cannot be placed, which variables can and cannot be grouped together. Here is an example from the same prep test. And if we looked at the scenario only and not the rules, for this particular prep test game, there are over 5,000 combinations that you can have, right? If we look at only it's the second line in the rules, the cons live in the fourth house. If we use only that line and apply that line to the scenario and try to figure out all the different combinations, we've narrowed it down to 720. And that's just with that one line. You will never, I'm not going to say never, you will very rarely are there games where you could figure out all of the possible combinations in a timely manner. You only get about 8 minutes and 45 seconds for each game. So if you are someone who is great at math, then I suggest if you're great at math, you know probability and combinatorics, then and you could do that in your head really fast, then go for it. But most of us we can't. So I wouldn't spend too much time trying to figure out all the different combinations because that really is just a time suck, and it won't really help you on the game. In depth into We'll go more in depth into the rules and scenario when we start working on the linear games. The last part that we're going to talk about are the questions. There are two types. There are the global questions, which are simply the questions. The correct answer choice will be based on the information in the scenario and the information in the rules only. There's no other information that will be used to answer the question. And the second one is sort of like a global question, but on steroids. Local questions. These are questions that will impose a new condition in addition to the initial rules. It'll say things like, if M is if M plays on Wednesday, what must be true? Or if M plays on Thursday, what could be true? Excuse me. Any conditions in that question do not apply to any other questions. It's just that it's just specific to that question. And so I guess we're done with the basic logical logic games background information. Let's kind of go into something that has a little bit more meat. Conditional reasoning. I hate conditional reasoning. I think it sucks. It haunts me in my dreams. I kid you not, I've had dreams about conditional reasoning. It's scary. So here we are. We're just going to do just a very brief introduction because the conditional reasoning on the logic games is very simple. I mean, I'm not going to say it's completely different, but it is different from what you will see in the logical reasoning section of the exam. So what is conditional reasoning? If I looked it up, and this is what it is. A broad name given to the logical relationships composed of sufficient and necessary conditions. And so what's a sufficient condition? Because when I first was learning this stuff on my own, I was like, huh? A sufficient Um, a sufficient condition is an event or circumstance whose occurrence indicates that a necessary condition must also occur. And the necessary condition is an event or circumstance whose occurrence is required in order for a sufficient condition to occur. English does it. So we need English, please. So basically what that is saying is if the sufficient condition exists, then the necessary condition also exists. Don't think too much about it. Just accept that as a fact. Like, accept it as a fact that the sky is blue. Accept it as a fact that if I pick up an apple and I drop it, gravity is what makes it fall to the ground. It's a fact. Just leave it at that. Just remember that. Um, so what's next? Now, if the necessary condition does not exist, then the sufficient condition cannot exist. And this is basically what a contrapositive is. And we'll go into contrapositives in a couple of slides. Well, what you can't have, but what I wanted to say is the necessary condition can occur, but just because it occurs, it does not mean that the sufficient condition also occurs. So, in terms of logic games, it's very important. It's very possible that if you have a rule that states if A is if A plays on Wednesday, then B plays on Thursday. It's very possible. It's completely possible, plausible that B could play on on Thursday, and A doesn't play on Wednesday. What is never okay and what can never happen is if A plays on Wednesday, but B doesn't play on third. I'm sorry. If what can't happen is if A plays on Wednesday and B does not play on Thursday. That violates the very first fact I told you to memorize and to take it as a rule of law. And that's why we have the contrapositive. Basically, it's just saying, um, you know, if the necessary condition does not exist, the sufficient condition cannot exist because if it did, and the necessary condition isn't there, then that's just wrong. That's a crime against nature. And here I have an example. If A, then B, and we see B can always occur. B is not dependent on A, but A is dependent on B. On the outset, there are a total of 6 different types of games. 3 of the games are rare. You will hardly ever see them. I think making a video is a waste of my time. And to be quite honest, all you need to do is get the Power Score Bible, go over the rare games, do a couple of the examples, and call it a day. Just in case that the game actually pops up on the exam, but it's highly unlikely. So the games that I'm going to go over are the games that occur in every single LSAT. And the first of which will be the linear games. And the second will be the grouping games. And the third will be the pure sequencing games. Now, about the is what that statement will come out to when we diagram it. F is the sufficient condition, and tilde study is the necessary condition. Now we're going to go a little bit into contrapositives. What are contrapositives and why they're important? This is the answer that I was given by Google, and it looks really, really confusing, but basically, what you're going to do is you're going to negate both the sufficient condition and the necessary condition, and then you're just going to switch them. So here we go. Here is our earlier example. Here's a diagram of that example, and this is what the contrapositive is. As you can see, we negated both terms. So F got a negative. Study, when you you negate something that's already negative, becomes positive. And then we switch the terms. We switch them, switch them over the arrow. That's all really a contrapositive is. It's really important that you know this for the logic games, especially because if you see a conditional statement in the rules, you're going to be tested on whether or not you understand the contrapositive. It's a really easy way to confuse test takers, especially if they don't understand conditional reasoning and they don't understand contrapositives. But we will go into more depth at a later date. How do we recognize conditionality? Well, there are indicators. For sufficient condition indicators, there are if and when. For necessary condition, there is then, must, only if, and unless. When we go over the logical reasoning section of the exam, and I begin to discuss conditionality or conditional reasoning, however you want to phrase it, there are a lot more. But because the logic games, it's really straightforward, and it's conditionality at its simplest, and they only use, at most, you'll mostly see if then. You might see one that's not on here. You might see whenever, which is a sufficient condition, or you'll see when. That's pretty much it. Unless at the bottom is very, very special. Here's an example of an unless necessary condition. We have the unless, so it's indicating that there's a necessary condition, which then indicates that this is a conditional reasoning, a conditional statement. So with unless, you can't just take it as it is. You have to sort of turn it into an if-then statement, and I'm going to show you how. You take the term that is being modified by unless, which is Alvin doesn't study for the test, and that becomes the necessary condition. Then the leftover term, which would be then he will not receive an F, becomes the sufficient condition, and this is most important. You have to negate the sufficient condition. So this would be my diagram of that condition of the conditional statement that we just went over, and it's like all of the other ones except for the contrapositive, because basically when it comes to logical reasoning, once you boil down once you boil down the conditional statements to a diagram, you can see the logical relationship easier. And I think that does it, because this is the end. And next time we will go over linear games in depth. I will try to do. I think I'm going to try to do maybe at most go over 5 games in depth, um, so that you can understand it. Linear games are really my favorite. So I will see you next week. Bye.